Okay, so recently I've been working on this small project on procedural generation, and in particular about sort of memory efficient procedural generation, which allows you to generate very, very large maps without sort of taking up too much space. This is like very heavily inspired by games like Minecraft or Terraria, where you have seemingly endless terrain without taking up terabytes of storage. So for example, I'll just go ahead and run the program, and this is, for example, one terrain which is generated. And the way this is generated is by taking a bunch of random numbers and interpolating it, getting some form of Berlin noise, which we'll get into definitely, and stacking on different layers or different octaves of Berlin noise to give this a more bumpy feel. And obviously there's parameters that you can play around with to make the terrain more hilly or more rigid or whatnot. So for example, if I increase the amplitude, that will make the terrain it'll just make it more hilly in a sense, right? So you can see the effects on the amplitude. So that's interesting, definitely, but my main focus was how this is endless, in quotes. It's not endless, and because there's just one thing which limits it from being endless. But just to show one aspect of this, that this terrain sort of continues on, and if I scroll through it, I can see different parts of this terrain. So the way this is all set up is that the terrain is broken into chunks, and each chunk right now is about like 32 of these sort of blocks, right? And sorry, if you go here right now, if I press X, you'll see I'm at chunk 86 out of 1 quadrillion. And storing 1 quadrillion takes a lot of memory, you would assume. But if I try to output the memory usage, it says it's using about 103,000 kilobytes, which is a lot of memory, but a lot of that memory cost is just coming from SDL, from just sort of showing all of this as an image. It's also because I'm using very bad textures now that I realize that the images I'm using for textures are very big. But that's where a lot of that cost in the kilobytes is coming. And you can sort of scroll through this, and this is near endless. The reason why this has a limit is simply because I need to know which chunk I'm on, and that needs to be stored in an integer or a double, or I believe long, or 128 size integers. It needs to be stored in something, which is what's limiting how big I can make this. If I use even larger and larger numbers, for a very small trade-off in memory, I can make even bigger terrain. So for example, just by using maybe 32 bytes more, I could have a terrain which is like 1 billion times larger than even this. And 32 bytes is not much when you think of how many kilobytes the whole program is using, right? So that's the general gist of it. What I want to show is I want to highlight that memory usage thing. So right now this is a very big map, right? Like 1 quadrillion, I believe that's how much it is. So let me sort of make the map smaller. Let's say instead of having 2 to the 50 chunks, I have 2 to the 4 chunks. So that's 16 chunks. And so I can run this, and there's a lot of errors, but ignore those, please. And so this generates this map, and if I press X, okay, it says there's only 16 chunks, and I see this. So if I just go ahead further and further here, so now I'm at chunk 9, chunk 11, 13, 14, 15, and I'm here at chunk 1 once again. Now if we look at the memory usage of this, so this is still 100,000. So before it was 104,000, now it's 100,000, and I think 4,000 kilobytes for an extra quadrillion chunks is not that much. And generally the difference in the kilobytes is mainly because of the fact that they're just like, it's a bit random that how much memory will be allocated to a process isn't exactly fixed. So if I run this again, perhaps it might still have, yeah, so now it has 99,000 kilobytes of memory. The question is, how is this sort of being generated? Well, the way it's generated is there'll be some chunks which are in the viewport. So right now I'm at chunk number 1, and I'm pretty sure this sort of area, this right area, would be chunk number 2, right? This area. So I can break blocks, which I thought I wanted to add that because it's cool. So this area is probably chunk 2, and this area is probably chunk 1. So when I need to sort of show what's on screen, what I do is I figure out which chunks are going to be on screen. So there's chunk 1 and there's chunk 2. Chunk 1, because it's probably the leftmost part, is chunk 1, and this is probably chunk 2. And then I'll generate chunk 1, chunk 2, and then one chunk before and one chunk after, something along those lines. And so I'm only rendering in 5 chunks at a time. Now the problem is, okay, let's say I move forward. How is it? So now I'm at like maybe 6 and 7. Wait, let me check. I'm at chunk 6 and probably 7. And so I should have chunk 5 and 4 loaded, and chunk 8 and 9 loaded as well. But chunk 1 and 2 should have been gone from the program's memory. That's how it works. But if I scroll back, I will see these marks that I placed earlier, because we're back at chunk 1 and chunk 2, and you will see that it's the exact same chunks as it was before. The reason that is every time I make a chunk, it's made by using a random number. So when I move back to chunk 1 and chunk 2, I reconstruct the chunk not by having the whole information about the chunk in memory, but by simply knowing which random number I used to generate that chunk. What the chunk itself was, I just store, or I don't even store that. I figure out what was used to generate the chunk, and then I use that to rebuild the chunk. Now, if you rebuild the chunk, the question is, okay, why weren't these gaps sort of refilled in the blocks that we sort of cut out? And technically those were filled in, but now to incorporate block breaking and to incorporate player changes, generally what you do is you store player changes somewhere, and now you can just generate the terrain and then you can apply the player changes after the fact. That's sort of the idea of how I am generating the terrain here. So okay, that's an interesting idea, right? You just use the same random number to sort of regenerate the terrain, so that way your terrain is always sort of consistent. It's always the same terrain at the same part of the map. But how exactly is that happening? Well, most of that magic is happening in Perlin.cpp, and this requires some knowledge of how random numbers work. So there are multiple different ways of generating random numbers. The way which I'm using is a LCG, linear congruential generator, I believe that's what it is. And basically what it does is it starts with some base z0, which is, let's say it's like 5, okay, and we pass it through this formula. So z0 is a base, and let's say I call my random number z1. So the random number is produced from z0 by doing the following. So we multiply z0 by a number a, which is generally pretty large, and we add a number c, which might also be pretty large, and then we take sort of the remainder of all of this. Perhaps maybe I should draw with percentage symbol, the remainder of all of this with respect to some large number m. So take my base, multiply it by a large number, add some number, take the remainder with respect to another large number, and then that will give me z1, and that, for example, z1 will be like 13285, which is kind of random. And sometimes you don't want numbers which are very large. Maybe I want my random number to be between 1 and 5, so then I can just further take the remainder with like 5 and then sort of add 1 to get this between 1 and 5. But that's the idea, that you can generate z1 by multiplying by a large number, adding something, and taking remainder. Now what happens is, in LCGs is now when I want to get a second random number, what I do is I use a similar formula, but instead of using Z0 or Z0, I use Z1. Okay, and that's how I generate the second random number. And a similar thing for the third. For the nth random number, this becomes a Zn equals to A times Zn minus 1 plus C. Okay, so that's how random numbers are generated. This is one way to generate random numbers. And so this is one way we can generate random numbers. And so what I can do is I can use Z1 for my first chunk, Z2 for my second chunk, Zn for the nth chunk. The only problem here is two things. Firstly, this isn't exactly a reversible operation. I can't use Z2 to figure out Z1 or Zn to figure out Zn minus 1. All right? And so the problem becomes that, okay, let's say I was playing the game and I got to the fifth chunk. Okay, so I'm at the fifth chunk right now, and I sort of, or not even the fifth, let's make it the 50th chunk, and I want to go back and I want to go to the 30th chunk. Well, for that, for me to regenerate the 30th chunk, I need to know what Z30 is. The problem there is the only easy way, it seems, would be to find Z0. So there's two options. Either I store Z30, which would then start costing a lot of memory, so it becomes a question of, hey, is this even worthwhile? Or the other option is I start with Z0 and I find Z1, and I use that to find Z2, and I sort of do this up until Z30. So over here, for example, I have a very high cost on memory, and here I have a very high cost on time, because it takes time to sort of execute this process. The nice little thing is that if we go back to our sort of recurrence, we can actually sort of simplify this a little, and if we were to simplify it, we can get the following recurrence, that the nth number is a result of taking A and multiplying it with Z0, but it's A to the n instead of just A. And we add to it, so now there was the constant term, but instead of the constant term, we end up with a summation of A to the I times C, where I goes from 0 to n minus 1. I believe it's something of this nature, but this is a geometric formula, so you can sort of reduce this to A to the I minus 1 over A minus 1. I believe it's something of that nature, and you just multiply this by C. So you can sort of reduce this, and that way you can get a sort of closed form for your Zn. Now the only problem that comes here is that, okay, this exponent here and this exponent here, oh sorry, my bad, this should not be I, this should be n, because it should be with respect to this, right? But the problem becomes that n can get quite large, right? N can be in the billions, and the problem becomes, okay, how do I take an exponent to the billions? Also, one small thing, all of this is mod m. Well, the way you can take a power to the billions is sort of think of it like this. So if I ask you for a to the power n, one thing that you can do is you can do a times a times a n times, or something which is easier to do is first you take a and you get a square. Now you take a square and you multiply with itself to get a to the 4. Now you take a4, you multiply with itself to get a to the 16. So you see, in just about 3-4 steps, I've reached a to the 16. So, not 16, it should be a to the 8, because the power doubles, it doesn't square. But you can see how this sort of lets the power grow very fast. And this is a general idea between this sort of exponentiation, which works in around log n multiplications, you can get the number that you want. You can get this huge power, you can get this huge power. There's a little bit of modular arithmetic that goes on here, and there was a nice article which I found on it, which I will definitely link, and you can check that out for more information. But this is the gist of how you can generate random numbers which are further along in the sequence, and that way you can sort of reconstruct that chunk with relatively less execution time. And that's sort of the gist of behind how the chunks are being generated, and then how they're generated without using much memory nor much time, and sort of being generated on the spot as needed. Just 2-3 more things which I regard just before ending is that back to Berlin noise. So the way the Berlin noise is being generated is that, okay, I take two random numbers, and let's say random numbers in the range like 1 to 20. So maybe the first random number is like 7, and the second random number is like 8. Not 8, sorry, 18. So now if I'm trying to generate a terrain using these random numbers, what I can do is I can sort of start from 7 and I can go to 18, right? But if it's too close, this looks way too jagged. Like this, if there were more random numbers in my series, it would start looking like this, which is very, very hilly and very sharp. So what you do is you sort of move the 18 a bit further away, and in between you sort of fill things which are in the middle. Now when you're filling things in the middle, if you just make it like linearly proportional, like just like a line, it kind of is a bit boring. So a lot of times one thing that people do is do a cubic or a cosine interpolation. They're both slightly different things, but if you can imagine how cosine sort of looks like this, like it has a nice smoother curve. So here basically you're doing the same thing, we're trying to make a nice smoother curve. And this is how you sort of get more natural looking terrain. This still does have a downside in that it still is too smooth and too consistent, one would argue. And so the way you sort of make this nicer and even more interesting is now you take another octave of terrain, and basically this will be something with like things a bit less spaced apart. So instead of maybe it might be like in one big wave of this, you have like 4 smaller waves, and these have smaller effects. So for example, this might have a wave like this, and then you sort of add this bump onto your original terrain, and that makes it look like this. And now you start to get a more hillier terrain. So like the gist of the idea is you made one nice smooth wave, and then you make another nice wave but which is a bit less smooth and a little bit less sharp, and you sort of stack that on top of this. And if you just add up these sort of tiny changes, add up these octaves, which is the term which is normally used, then you can get a nice hillier terrain, as you would find in here. And that's why you get these like nicer hillier terrains. Yeah, so that I think covers most of the points of this project. The main things that I learned here were just how do random numbers work themselves, and a little bit of modular arithmetic was involved, which was pretty fun to read up on. But so all in all, a lot of things to learn, and I hope that my explanation helped a little bit. Thank you.